Gowri at Durian ASEAN. We're having our Blast from the Grassroots session now. I'm here with Dr. Tessa Houghton. How are you, Tessa?
I'm great, thank you.
So she's a director with the Center of Studies for Communication and Culture from the University of Nottingham, Malaysian campus. So Tessa, why don't you tell us a little bit of what do you do and a little background to yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a New Zealander, to explain the accent.
Okay.
I moved to Malaysia 2.5 years ago to join the School of Modern Languages and Cultures, which hosts the research centre, the Centre for the Study of Communications and Culture. What we focus on primarily is looking at the intersection of culture, media and democracy, essentially, within Malaysia and increasingly within ASEAN as well.
Okay, so you're here to talk about investigative journalism, right? Yeah. So maybe you can tell us what investigative journalism is for an introduction?
Yeah, sure. Investigative journalism is kind of a specific subsection of journalism that builds on what I'd call kind of the democratic theory of journalism, or kind of public good theory of journalism. Basically, the media are one of the primary ways that we receive information, that we learn about the world that we live in. So it's incredibly important for any democratic system that the media are providing good quality information. So in terms of what good journalism should be doing, or kind of a healthy journalism culture should be providing, it should be, and I'm quoting from kind of an article here that sums it up quite nicely, I think.
Okay.
It should have the ability to provide a rigorous account of people who are in power and people who wish to be in power in the government, corporate and non-profit sectors. It must regard the information needs of all people as legitimate, and if anything, it should favour the informational needs of those less privileged people in society. It must be able to reliably separate truth from lies and to keep liars kind of accountable, basically, to function as kind of an early warning system to stop crises happening. And it must provide a wide range of informed opinions on the important issues of the times. So everyday journalism should be kind of providing a baseline level of reliable, balanced information. Investigative journalism could be summed up as telling stories that powerful people don't want to be told, essentially. It involves going deeper. It involves finding information that's not readily available. So everyday journalism will often kind of go around beats to places like Parliament, the courts, and gather information from those places, not in a passive way, but in a kind of reliable way. You know the information's going to be there.
Right.
Investigative journalism is often working with, or attempting to work with, and find information that's not readily accessible, that may have been hidden, that may be kind of coming from anonymous sources a lot of the time. Obviously, there are sensitive issues involved with it a lot of the time, but that is trying to uncover truths that someone has tried to hide for the greater good of society.
So do you think it's actually possible to do this? Is it not difficult? Is it dangerous? What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's both of those things. I mean, even in sort of more democratic countries, or kind of less repressive environments, it's a very difficult thing to do. Right. It's very time consuming, which makes it very expensive. And I mean, there's a lot of discussion about newspapers particularly, but kind of journalism and the news industry in general being under increasing economic pressures all over the world. So there's that pressure on it in the first place, that it's, you need to kind of let journalists go and spend quite a bit of time sometimes just for one story, you know. So there's that pressure. Obviously, when you introduce it into an environment like Malaysia, or within many states within ASEAN, there are other difficulties in that there's a huge lack of transparency in terms of the information that can be gathered. People are often very scared or unwilling to talk to journalists about sensitive issues. There's a lack of protection for sources and for journalists in terms of legislation and the law. And then obviously there is the threat of kind of physical violence, non-legislative or non-legal means of suppressing journalists or punishing or disciplining journalists.
So the challenges, just now you talked about the challenges of investigative journalism. So what do you think is the current state of media freedom maybe in ASEAN?
It's pretty terrible, really, is unfortunately the answer to that. Okay. I mean, Malaysia is in a bad state. It's gradually falling down and down the various press freedom indexes. So this year it fell to 147 out of 179 countries in the World Press Freedom Index from Reporters Without Borders. If we look at ASEAN generally, Malaysia is one of the worst in ASEAN, but they generally, ASEAN countries are doing badly. So Brunei is ranked 117, Thailand 130, Indonesia is 132, Cambodia 144, Myanmar 145. So they're all slightly better than Malaysia, or significantly better. The Philippines, Singapore, Laos and Vietnam are ranked worse than Malaysia in terms of press freedom, and with Laos and Vietnam being very, very close to the bottom of the rankings.
So can I know who's actually on top of that list?
The countries that come out on top of that list are kind of happily, I guess, New Zealand is often quite close.
Oh, okay.
There tends to be a fairly strong correlation from what I've seen from these indexes between general statistics to do with kind of democratic freedoms and also these press freedom indexes, as well as things like corruption indexes. New Zealand, Scandinavian countries as well, which tend to have, those Scandinavian countries in particular tend to have strong monitored public service or kind of public state-sponsored support for journalism, but there's a very clear demarcation of that monetary support and political interference being kept free from it.
Okay.
So the relationship between state support is managed a lot differently.
So do you think that is the major determining factor that separates New Zealand from the ASEAN countries that makes New Zealand better?
New Zealand is doing better. New Zealand has actually got a funny history in terms of kind of deregulation, economic deregulation of the media industry. So it is actually a very heavily commercialized industry.
Okay.
There is state support for various aspects of the industry, but the state-owned enterprises, so the television stations, state-owned enterprises, they're expected to make money, but they are kept independent still from the government. Scandinavian countries, I think, probably provide a better model. New Zealand is it's kind of sometimes difficult to work out why the media are still maybe as good as they are. Sometimes I think that I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but there's a strong history and strong support structure of subsidies being given to public service media in Scandinavian countries, which allows them to function, allows them to have the money to do things like investigative journalism and to provide the kind of news that we need to kind of function democratically without getting the political interference that so often comes along with state money.
So, sorry, where was this money coming from for this NGOs, is it?
For where do you mean?
For the Scandinavian countries?
No. In Scandinavia, there's a subsidy system. So taxpayer money is used to prop up is not the right word. Prop up has negative connotations, but to support public service journalism, essentially.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, what do you think are examples of good investigative journalism practice?
This is what we're going to be talking about with our visitor, Mark Hunter.
Okay.
Yeah. What he is talking about on Saturday is obviously there are strong and important issues to do with accessing information. The ability to do that varies widely in kind of different circumstances. From some of the research that I do, I know how difficult it is to get some of the information that would be important to doing various investigative journalism stories in Malaysia. Things like the Official Secrets Act can be used very easily to just say, no, you're not getting that information. So there are practices to do with accessing that information in the first place. But what he's going to be talking about is a kind of concept that he calls story-based reporting or story-based journalism. So it's going through a particular kind of methodology for writing, engaging, and kind of gripping investigative journalism that can actually bring about social change. The way that the model that he proposes and that he trains people to use is basically using a kind of hypothesis model. So it's starting in the same way as you do kind of academic research in a large respect, with a hypothesis that something has happened or something is true. So a particular kind of government abuse has occurred. Mm-hmm. What the journalists are then trained to do, or what he trains them to do, is to basically use that hypothesis to frame their investigative practices. So once you know, once you have something that's kind of a statement that you need to either prove or disprove, it becomes much easier to break it down into what information you need to either prove it or disprove it.
Okay.
So working within that framework and then working beyond that to actually kind of craft a narrative that brings people in, that means that it's not just good investigative journalism that's uncovering facts but then hardly anyone reads it. It's making it a piece of journalism that people read and engage with and kind of want to take action in response to, and actually does bring about some good.
Okay. So what countries are actually practicing the story-based journalism? Does everyone know about it, or?
It's his model, and he works with quite a few different training institutes and kind of international non-governmental organisations like the UN, Open Society Foundation, various other groups. He works, from what I know, quite closely with Arab journalists.
Okay.
So obviously it's another location or region that is also a difficult location within which to practice investigative journalism.
Okay.
Yeah. But investigative journalism is practiced all over the world, really.
Okay.
His book is actually, and it may be useful, I guess, for journalists in the region to know. It's a free online resource, so this methodology can be accessed there, and there's a lot of information.
So the book
on the
is
website.
called Story-Based Journalism?
Story-Based Reporting, I believe the
Story-based
book's
reporting.
called. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the life and work of Mark Lee Hunter?
Yeah, sure, I can. This will be the first time that I've met him. I've not met him before, so
okay.
it's just going to be a wee bit of a potted biography. So basically, he's interesting in that he's kind of a hybrid of an academic and a journalist.
Okay.
From what I understand, he moved into academia having already been a journalist previously, but is focused on investigative journalism within his kind of research role and also within his practice. And he's still functioning as both a journalist and an academic, as well as kind of an activist, I guess, in terms of training people to use this method and promoting investigative journalism. So he works at INSEAD, INSEAD, which is a business-focused university in the Social Innovation Centre. He's a founding member of the Global Investigative Journalism Network, which was founded in 2003, and is on its coordinating committee, and has kind of won numerous awards both for his academic writing and also for his investigative journalism. So he's very interesting in that he's got these kind of dual perspectives, I guess, kind of a theoretical, critical take on what journalism is, and then or investigative journalism, and then also this practical experience to actually be able to work on a methodology that can be used to train people to kind of spread an efficient way to do it.
So with Mark Lee Hunter, is there any one of his notable work that you know of? Or?
I guess it depends whether you're wanting to read his articles or his more practical, I guess.
Probably some
work.
big story that he has uncovered.
He's done kind of a wide range of stories, which I guess is true of most journalists. They tend to, although there are some that obviously are specialists, but covers a lot of different ones. One of the ones that he is kind of says, or that he's particularly proud of, is a series of articles that were showing how a particular kind of quite obscure law in the US had created a population of handicapped children who were being cut off from welfare rolls. So it's finding these kind of abuses of power that sometimes happen purposively, or kind of somewhat there's kind of malicious intent behind it, or sometimes just happen because systems fail, essentially. But whatever the cause of those kind of breakdowns in systems, and when kind of the people who are supposed to be leading and governing society make mistakes, investigative journalism needs to be there to kind of find those mistakes, help us understand them, and then push for kind of rectifying them.
All right. So what are your hopes or aspirations for the future of investigative journalism in ASEAN?
I think that certainly within Malaysia, and I think within ASEAN generally, there is a huge problem with legislation being used to suppress, repress journalists. In Malaysia is the Printing Presses and Publications Act. There's the Sedition Act as well. There is in various places throughout the region lèse majesty laws, which create huge problems if you want to criticise the monarchy in any way. So there is a really big problem with a lot of this legislation, and what is unfortunately often the case as well is that governments will kind of talk the talk about reformist agendas and softening legislation, and will make very superficial amendments to legislation, which they say is kind of reforming it, making it less repressive, but in actual fact it's not. And I mean, we've seen that in Malaysia with the amendments to the Printing Presses and Publications Act, which haven't actually affected the ability for it to be used to kind of crush oppositional journalism that kind of threatens the government in any way. So I think that is a huge part of it. Unfortunately, a lot of the times legislative change of that kind comes along with political change, a broader political change, whether it's regime change or whether it's kind of broader pressure coming from society. And I think that we see that happening in multiple locations, including Malaysia, that there is continued and kind of increasing resistance and also awareness of things like the need for media freedom to support these kind of desires and hopes for democratization, I guess. It becomes more difficult in the kind of trickier parts of ASEAN, I guess. We're talking here about places like Laos, Cambodia, although Cambodia is kind of fairly similar to Malaysia in some respects. What's interesting about the region is that there is this kind of general legislative problem, and there are locations where there is much stronger governmental control than others, but there are also strange quirks. So the Philippines has got relatively free in terms of kind of legislation and governmental control, but there's a huge problem with violence against journalists. So there are commonalities within ASEAN, but there are also differences that are quite important to take into account.
I think I was reading a news that Vietnam are also using violence against their journalists there. Yeah,
it's a problem throughout the region. And I mean, the interesting thing with kind of journalism in this region, particularly investigative journalism, is that it is very, very activist in nature. So the problem beyond it is that journalists are getting flack as activists, not just as journalists. So if we look at the Cambodian example, where there's kind of increasing resistance to land grabs, essentially, activists and journalists are disappearing. So obviously we're assuming there's kind of violence behind it, but they're being disappeared essentially for working on these kind of issues that require investigation and that require publicity about whatever practices are leading to these kind of displacements of people and selling off of land.
So do you think there's anything we can do about it in Malaysia?
I think that what people need to realise is that if they want good journalism, and if we know that the government isn't going to support it, then we need to support it. We can support it symbolically through kind of speaking out and standing up for journalists, but there is also a huge necessity for economic support. Obviously within Malaysia, or most people I think realise that within Malaysia, the press, the media that aren't under governmental control are the online media. Unfortunately, the online space is very, very difficult to make money in. It's much more difficult than making money in traditional broadcasting or in print journalism. Malaysia Kini has kind of eventually cracked it with kind of the English subscription model in combination with advertising, but a lot of websites, news websites, struggle hugely to make enough money to survive, let alone to put in the kind of money that's necessary to do investigative journalism. So there is financial support required as well, and whether that's buying a subscription or whether it's making a donation, or whether it's kind of thinking about, and this is something that I hope that we'll talk about with Mark as well, is the idea of discussing new revenue models, essentially, for journalism.
Right.
So there are increasing kind of numbers of diverse ways to collect money. It may be kind of, rather than a subscription, having the ability for donations to be collected by a particular website. There's also an increasing number, not so much within this region that I'm aware of, but certainly in the US and various other places, of kind of investigative journalism for hire is kind of a simplistic way to put it, but essentially people saying, we would like you to find out about this, or or kind of journalists having ideas and people saying, yeah, we'd like you to run with that one. We will give you money to investigate that story. So it's very kind of public-driven journalism. But obviously all of these things are, like so many things online, rapidly changing, dynamic. It's still very much in the stage where kind of any support that a lot of these alternative media can get is really important.
Okay. So I think that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you very much, Tessa, for joining us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Okay.